Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first unit in Introduction to Psychology. We're going to talk about psychology and scientific thinking. And so we're really going to use this week to sort of lay the groundwork for everything else that we're going to do in this class. We're going to talk about what is psychology, how is it a science, what is this idea of scientific or critical thinking. You've probably heard those words before, but you may not have a great understanding of what they mean. That's what we're going to dig into a bit in this week's topic. I always like to start by giving you a bit of a roadmap. So, what we're going to talk about. I've broken this week's content into three overarching units. So, we'll start with what is psychology? I'd imagine that many of you have an idea or an understanding of what you think psychology is. Maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong, maybe you're somewhere in between, but that's what we're going to talk about first. Well, let's talk about psychological pseudoscience. You may have heard that term before, but we're really going to dig into what it means and why it's related. Boom. And we'll end this week's topic by talking about psychology's past and present. So we're going to take a bit of a history tour, a bit of a history crash course, really, through the field of psychology, thinking about where the field is now, but also how we got here. Now, if you go on Canvas to this week's module, you will see a true and false activity. It looks something like this. Hopefully that is coming up in my screen share. Yes, I see it. I asked you to go through and not really think about it. Don't think too hard. Don't look it up. Just kind of give your gut answer. So things like most people only use about 10% of their brain. Is that true or false? When it comes to love, opposites attract. And so I want to go through you can do it now or you can do it after you're finished watching the videos. But go through and answer, give true, false answers. Um, I want you, while you're doing this activity, to think about how difficult you're finding it. Right? Are you finding it easy? Are you finding it challenging? Are you sort of um, rethinking things you thought you knew? But I also want you to think about where the information came from. So if you're saying true to something, think about why you're answering true. A lot of these topics are things that we are going to come back to over the course of this semester. I will post the answers to this activity at the end of the week so you can see if you got them right. I'm not grading it or anything, but I want you to really think about what we know about psychology and how much of it is actually rooted in, and how much of it is kind of tribal knowledge or things that we think we know. So let's think about what is psychology. Take a second, and I asked you to do this in your introductory post, but what are three things that come to mind when I say psychology? Don't think too hard about it, just sort of free associate. Take a second and do that. If you said something like therapy or mental health or depression or helping people, you'd be right. Absolutely. Mental health studies and mental health counseling and therapy are a major part of the field of psychology, but they're not the only part. And that tends to be a misconception. People tend to think that psychology is therapy and that is it. Um, sure, part of it, but there's more than that. So I'm a psychologist, but my training is in developmental psychology. I am not a therapist. I have never conducted therapy sessions. I don't know how to do so. I am not trained to do so. So just because you're a psychologist doesn't mean that you are a clinician. Any of you who are psych majors, have you ever told someone that you were a psych major and have them say, "Are you analyzing me right now?" I get that a lot. Um, I don't make a habit of randomly analyzing people that I know, even if I had the training and the skill set to do so. And so my point here is that many people have a pretty unclear or sort of surface level understanding of what psychology is and what it is that psychologists do. Just like any field, it can be really broad. We do a whole lot of different things, and there are different sort of subfields where people are proficient in different areas. Now, if I were asked to ask you to define psychology or say, what is psychology? Sounds like it should be pretty easy. This is a term we use a lot, but it's actually quite difficult. No matter what subfield of psychology you're coming from, if you're coming from clinical or social, developmental, behavioral, neuro. Um, Everyone agrees that the term psychology really broadly is difficult to define. And so I want you to take a second and think about why that might be. This is also going to be a recurring theme throughout this course. I'll say a term, something that we hear a lot about. I'll ask you to think about a definition, and you'll probably struggle with it. That's because we tend to use words or use terms, but we never really stop to take a second and think, what does this actually mean? Okay. So part of the reason why psychology is so difficult to define is that field is just so vast. It encompasses so many different areas, which is something you'll start to see as we move through all of the different topics in this course. If I had to give a definition, if I really had to boil it down to what is psychology very broadly, I would say it's the scientific study, scientific, right? Meaning evidence, data driven, of the mind, the brain, and our behavior. But that's really broad. It's really, really, really broad. Again, part of it is because we're taking that step back and we're trying to make this definition fit for everybody. And so, related to this idea, we have what's called levels of analysis. Psychology spans all of these different levels or ways of looking at the same thing. And we can think about these levels as running from biological to social. So, if we start all the way down at the bottom, we're at this molecular level. We're looking at our very molecules. And as we move up and up, we're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Chemicals, the brain, mental ideas, thoughts, behavior, and finally ending with our social interactions. Okay, so it runs from sort of small to big or mental, biological to social. Now, if you were you may be sitting here wondering, well, which one of these is right? Which one of these levels of analysis should we be using to consider things like mental health or happiness or well-being or any number of different constructs? The answer is all of them. But here's the thing. Okay, Um, every different subfield of psychology is going to approach their science from one of these different levels. Okay, let me give you an example. Each level here is describing the same phenomenon. In this case, depression is the example we're using. We're just doing so from a different level, different perspective. So, neuropsychologists or biological psychologists are down here. They're looking at variations in genes, they're looking at chemicals, they're looking at neurotransmitters, and they're using those things to help understand why people may feel depressed. Clinical psychologist is probably going to live here. We're thinking about those depressive thoughts. Okay. I'm a loser. I'm worthless. I can't do it. Right. So a clinician is coming at it from the mental level. A behaviorist is here. We're not interested in how you think or feel. We're interested in what you do. Right. What does depression look like? Well, it looks like being really draggy. It looks like not wanting to get out of bed. It looks like not doing the things that you used to enjoy. A social psychologist is going to be up here. Well, I'm not so interested in the feats, but I'm interested in how depression impacts your relationship with others. So, depending on your discipline and on your training, you're going to tackle this from a different level. But if we're really trying to understand what depression is, we need the whole picture. We need every single piece of this puzzle from mind to behavior, all the way up at the top. Okay. To make it even more fun, these pieces can sort of interact. So you may have a biological or a genetic predisposition towards something like schizophrenia, but then it might be activated by stressors that occur at the social level. So we're going to come back to this. We'll talk more about that. That's kind of the whole nature nurture debate. We'll come back to that several times throughout the course of the semester. But it's important to sort of keep this ladder of analysis in your mind once we start talking about all of the different areas of psychology and understanding that psychologists recognize that we can't just treat the person as their behavior or we can't just treat them as their molecules because they're more than that. They're the whole puzzle. And so now that we've talked about sort of the complexity and the nuance of the field of psychology and how those different levels of analysis can make it really challenging to define psychology as a broad field, I want to talk about five specific challenges, excuse me, in defining psychology. But I also want to highlight how these challenges are Really part of what makes the field so complex and interesting and rewarding to study. Psychology is multiply determined. Human behavior is really difficult to predict, likely because our actions are produced by multiple factors. Every behavior that we engage in comes from a lot of different reasons. You're watching this video today. That's a behavior. Why are you doing it? Probably because you want a good grade, probably because you want to learn something, maybe because someone told you you have to, right? Our behaviors are influenced by a variety of different factors. So it's difficult to pinpoint just one. Another example is violence. Say we have a violent individual that we're working with. Okay. So maybe the individual's parents had some violent tendencies. So there's some sort of a genetic component. Sure, that makes sense. Um, Maybe also this individual grew up watching their parents respond to stress with violence. And so they lived in an environment where they learned that violence is an answer. So is that nature? Is that nurture? What are the reasons behind the person's violence? It's very difficult to pin down where and why behavior comes from, and it often comes from multiple sources. It is multiply determined. Relatedly, psychological influences are rarely completely independent of one another. Our experiences, thoughts, behaviors, etc., they're all highly dependent on each other. Let's think about a kid getting bullied at school. There could be lots of different factors involved. We know that during middle school, anything that makes someone stick out from their peers leaves them vulnerable to being victimized. Maybe they're overweight. Okay, so that's something that sort of makes them stick out and creates a scenario where they could be bullied. But it's also possible that because they're overweight, they're experiencing a lot of internalizing and negative body image, which then causes them to be introverted and more socially withdrawn, which is also a risk factor for being victimized. So it's all interrelated. It makes it very difficult to really nail down which factor or which combination of factors is leading to whatever it is that we're studying. There's also individual differences. We are not all the same. It's part of what makes psychology so fascinating. Really, we're interested in the study of individual differences. Different people are going to show huge variation in how they think, feel, behave, process emotion, personality, so on. And so part of what we do as psychologists is really try to broadly explain away these phenomena. We take a sample of the population and we look for statistical trends and patterns. It's a great approach to understanding the majority, but what it doesn't do is factor in those unique person by person differences. Imagine that you're on a playground in middle school and there's a group of kids playing basketball. And a couple other kids approach the basketball players and ask to join. They're told no, the game is full, no more room. So, how might those kids react? Okay, there's a lot of different ways they could react. Some might be really sad. Some might really internalize that. Maybe they're going to cry. Maybe they're going to feel rejected. Um, some are going to be angry. Some are going to get kind of belligerent and feel get really, really feisty about not being allowed to play. Other kids are just going to brush it off and say, okay, and go find something else to do. Right. So we see a lot of individual differences. It's the same exact scenario, but different responses based on the individual. So you may be wondering what drives how a person uh, might behave in a given situation. A lot of different things. It's multiply determined and everything is interrelated. Maybe the kids have a history of rejection, making them feel even more sensitive to experiences of rejection. Or maybe they're just highly resilient, and that allows them to bounce back a little bit. And so these individual differences really represent the true human experience. They also add challenges in terms of studying the majority and then making broad scale generalizations about human behavior. Reciprocal determinism is the idea that people influence one another and then mutually influence their behavior. Okay? We don't exist in a vacuum. Humans are a social species. You're going to be so sick of hearing me say that by the end of this semester. We influence one another and they influence us. Think about extroversion. Ever go to a party and the vibe is kind of low, not really doing much, and then that really extroverted person gets there and they are dancing, they're singing, they're running around, they're Extroversion, their sort of enthusiasm pulls up the vibe of the whole party, gets everyone else around them to be a little louder, a little rowdier. Right? Their extroversion sort of spreads and influences those around them, causing everyone else to behave in a bit more of an extroverted manner. Now, influence can come from a whole bunch of different sources. Our behavior can be influenced by our peer group, our church, our family, our colleagues, our friends. Context matters in psychology. Putting someone into different situations with different people is going to impact their behavior, which is really fascinating, but also makes it a challenge to isolate the causes of human behavior. I would imagine that you act very differently sitting in a classroom than you do when you're at a party or when you're at a family gathering. Context matters. Our behavior influences other people's behavior influences us. And finally, cultural differences are just so important to keep in mind. There are a lot of cultural differences um, between, for example, the Eastern cultures and Western cultures. Right. For example, someone might point out differences between the interdependent nature of East Asian cultures compared to the more independent Western cultures. Right. Historically, psychologists have really not done a very good job of incorporating cultural differences into our science. We do a lot of research on what we call a weird population. Let's see if I can do it. I always forget that acronym. The W is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Oh, I got it. Usually I mess at least one of them up. That group of people tend to be the ones that we do our research on, and then we try to generalize it and say, well, this applies to everybody. But I would argue that doing a study with participants who are from America, who are wealthy, who are educated, who are Democrat, does not really encompass the experiences of somebody who is a person of color, somebody who's not wealthy, somebody who has less of an education, so on and so forth. So we're trying to be better in the field of psychology about recognizing those cultural differences. And I do try to point them out for you as much as I can throughout this course. Now, while there's other factors that go into making up the field of psychology and making it both fascinating and challenging, these are five of the most common, and I hope that they're going to give you an idea really of the depth and breadth of the challenges that are faced by the field. Now, before we talk about psychology as a science, let's take a step back and ask, what is science? When you hear science, you might think of biology or physics or chemistry. I bet you're all picturing Bunsen burners and chemicals right now. And sure, those are science. But science is not just a body of knowledge like biology or chemistry. It's actually an approach. It's a way we think about collecting data or collecting evidence. Probably all heard of a theory. A theory is an explanation for a large number of findings that occur in the natural world. Theories are how we organize knowledge. They serve as a scaffolding or a framework that supports what we know. I like to think of theories as a bookshelf. So imagine a big empty bookshelf. And each shelf is sort of labeled with a different idea. And then as books come in this case, the books represent scientific studies. As those books come in, we file them away on the appropriate shelf. Eventually, once you have enough information and enough studies on your shelf, you can create theory. So theories, let us tie findings together and make new predictions or educated guesses about things we haven't yet observed based on what we do know. So if 99 times out of 100, when I do this thing, this other thing occurs, I can predict or I can theorize that when I do this thing, here's what's going to happen. Now, there's a few common misconceptions about theories. One is that a theory explains one specific event. Not so much. A theory actually contains a variety of diverse and testable observations. And we're going to talk a lot more next week about psychological research. And so some of this you can just kind of giving you the overview, and we'll dig more into this next week. People often think that a theory is just a guess. It's just sort of kind of, but it's a very, very educated guess. A theory comes from a large body of evidence that all points towards the same conclusion. So, for example, social learning theory, which was developed by Albert Bandura, suggests that people learn from one another via observation, imitation, and modeling. But Bandura didn't just pull this theory out of his hat. It was derived from lots and lots of evidence that all pointed to the same ideas. And so you may be wondering, at what point can we say that a theory has been proven? It's actually a trick question. You cannot ever prove a theory. I will say that again because that's very important. You cannot prove a theory. Our science is amazing. It can do some really, really cool things, but it's just not quite strong enough to be able to prove things. The thing is that research is done by humans. Humans can make mistakes. Maybe I did some of the math wrong in my study. Maybe my logic is off. Maybe I interpreted something incorrectly. We always have to leave that little bit of space to make sure that we acknowledge human error, but also acknowledge that new information can come out. Back at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we didn't know what was going on. People were washing their mail, washing their groceries. We thought that the virus might be airborne. It turned out not to be. We had to adapt as new information came in. So we always have to leave that space for new information. Now, science can protect us from some of the traps that are easy to fall into if we're not meticulous in our approach to research. It can actually help protect us from our own biases. It helps us to be objective, to look at facts, and to make data driven decisions. Bias is defined as prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way that's considered to be unfair. We're going to talk a lot more about bias later in the semester when we talk about social psychology. But for now, let's think about it in terms of our own biases. As scientists, we have to be really careful not to let our own experiences color our views. I'm a white woman. I see the world through the eyes of a white woman because that is what I am. Not really a whole lot I can do about that. But what I can do is educate myself and recognize the places where my experiences might be influencing my thoughts and feelings. We're ultimately going to fail at completely avoiding bias. It's not possible. Our goal becomes minimizing rather than eliminating bias. And so we can do this through becoming aware of our biases and finding ways to compensate for them. Say I'm running a study, say I'm running a focus group. Maybe instead of just me running all of the sessions, I have several other researchers who are people of different minority backgrounds, of different ages, of different sexual orientations, different cultures, whatever it is, because that's going to change the way people interact with each other. There's a lot of different things we can do. I want to talk about two of the more common forms of bias. First one is confirmation bias, or the tendency to seek out evidence that supports our hypotheses and deny, dismiss, or distort evidence that contradicts them. We commonly see this in people who only read articles that support their preferred political candidate or party and avoid or discount articles that show them in a negative light. My grandmother does this. My grandmother is, let's just say, enjoys watching Fox News. And so Fox News tends to support what she thinks about different political candidates. It's fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with watching Fox News. The thing is that it's very easy to say, well, I believe this thing. Look, I have all of this evidence that shows that I'm right. But you've only looked in one place. You have chosen your evidence in a biased way. Now, if you're watching all different news outlets and then come to your conclusion, that's a little bit different. And then there's belief perseverance. This is the tendency to stick to our individual beliefs even once the evidence contradicts them. Once we're set in our ways, and after we've sought out more evidence supporting our own hypotheses, we may be less likely to believe evidence that contradicts them. You ever tried to talk with somebody who has different religious or political beliefs from you? They tend to be very stubborn and steadfast. Likely that's because their belief perseverance is inhibiting them from opening their minds to things that go against what they think is true or correct. It tends to be very, very difficult to have those kinds of conversations. And so that brings us to our next topic, which is going to be pseudoscience. So I will pick up there in the next video.